It's been clear for a while now, and seems to get clearer and clearer with each new release. But Denis Villeneuve is undoubtedly one of the most exciting and consistently interesting filmmakers working today. He made his feature directorial debut in 1998 with August 32nd on Earth, and then over the next decade or so made several more drama films in his home country of Canada, Maelstrom 2000, Polytechnique 2009, and Incendies 2010. The last of those got decent recognition internationally, partly thanks to it being nominated for Best Foreign Language Film at the 2011 Academy Awards. These early films increased in scope and gradually got more recognized, and then the 2010s ended up being even more fruitful for Villeneuve, who spent several years directing hard-hitting English-language films that were attracting some high-profile stars. Prisoners and Enemy, both released in 2013, and then 2015 Sicario. Starting in 2016, things got even bigger and arguably better for Denis Villeneuve, as he started to focus on projects that fit within the science fiction genre. He's been 4 for 4, with 4 moving, visually spectacular, and thematically dense science fiction movies released between 2016 and 2024, all working together to show how he might be one of the best sci-fi directors working today. And maybe even of all time. Given they're all excellent movies, they're hard to rank, but here goes nothing. Here they are, starting with the great and ending with the greatest, starring Timothée Chalamet, Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac until its sequel went to even bigger, bolder, and perhaps better places. Dune stood as the most epic and large-scale movie within Denis Villeneuve's filmography and managed to hold such a title for a few years. It successfully adapted roughly the first half of the Frank Herbert novel of the same name to the big screen, which is no small feat, considering how ambitious, unique, and sometimes very strange the source material is. David Lynch made a respectable attempt at bringing Dune to the big screen in 1984, with a shaky yet interesting film, and then, of course, there was Alejandro Jodorowsky's notorious attempts to bring it to life in his own very strange way. The documentary about it from 2013 is a fun watch. But 2021's Dune is the one that more or less gets it right, and condenses the core components of the book's first half in a manner that's surprisingly digestible for newcomers, and hopefully not too basic or clean-cut for those who like the book's weirder elements. Sure, 2021's Dune can feel a little conventional, and those who want sci-fi trippiness might genuinely be better off with the messier and more Lynchian 1984 version that really goes off the rails at a certain point. Perhaps intentionally so. But this 2021 take on Dune, the first half of what's now a 2-part epic, is a fantastic introduction to the factions of the story who are in conflict, the world itself, and many of the story's memorable characters. It's a take on Dune that just about anyone can get into, and that's got to count for something. Starring Ryan Gosling, Harrison Ford. Ana de Armas making a sequel to a movie as legendary as 1982's Blade Runner was never going to be an easy task, yet Denis Villeneuve pulled off the near impossible and made it work in 2017. Several years before successfully adapting half of the unadaptable Dune. The Ridley Scott-directed original Blade Runner is about as essential as cinematic science fiction gets, telling a simple story that has a rich world and tons of thematic depth. Following one man assigned with hunting down some rogue replicants while using this premise to explore human nature, the meaning of life, and the complications of technological advancement. Blade Runner 2049 wisely jumps forward in time, being set approximately 3 decades on from its year of release, similar to how 1982's Blade Runner jumped forward in time to 2019. Blade Runner 2049 relegates Harrison Ford's protagonist from the first film into a supporting role, with new characters played by the likes of Ryan Gosling and Ana de Armas stealing the show. Though that being said, perhaps the biggest star of Blade Runner 2049 isn't even an actor, it's Roger Deakins, who did the unbelievably gorgeous cinematography. Blade Runner 2049 succeeds as a sequel to Blade Runner not only because it continues to tell an interesting narrative within the film's world, but also because it's just as technically ambitious and awe-inspiring as the original film and its distinct visuals. Perhaps the first movie has a little more depth and things to chew on, and definitely has more memorable music. Hans Zimmer and Benjamin Wallfisch composed a good score, but the Vangelis score from the original is untouchable, but this sequel is still great. And another winning sci-fi movie in Villeneuve's body of work, starring Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Rebecca Ferguson. Speaking of great movie sequels, Dune, Part 2 is another stunning one directed by Denis Villeneuve, though here, he got to make a sequel to a film he'd already directed, with Dune and Dune Part 2 now feeling like a stunning duology. There is still story left to tell within the Dune universe, of course, and Villeneuve has expressed interest in adapting Frank Herbert's second Dune novel, Dune, Messiah, which could ultimately make this a trilogy. But, for now, it's a Duneology, and these two movies work in tandem to be a complete adaptation of the original 1965 novel, with it being likely that once both movies are accessible at home, many viewers will opt to treat Dune and Dune Part 2 as an entire epic worth marathoning. In Dune Part 2, protagonist Paul Atreides confronts his destiny while seeking revenge against those who betrayed House Atreides in Dune 2021, all the while becoming something of a messiah for the Freeman. Plenty of other characters are introduced here, which serves the purpose of widening the scope of the story that was seen in the original and making this sci-fi epic feel, appropriately enough, even more epic. Every returning character goes to some interesting, more complex, and often darker places, too, with Timothée Chalamet as Paul, Zendaya as Chani, and Javier Bardem as Stilgar all shining extra bright here. The battles are bigger, the stakes are higher, the visuals and music prove as grand as ever, and things end on a note that feels appropriate while leaving room for further conflicts to be explored in a later film, or even films. Dune Part 2 does just about everything you'd want a sequel to an already epic movie to do, really. Starring Amy Adams, Jeremy Renner, Forrest Whitaker, there's an argument to be made that Denis Villeneuve's first proper science fiction movie, 2016's Arrival, is his best, and indeed one that's likely to be considered an all-time great one within the genre as time goes on. Of course, its relative recency means it can't quite be declared as great as something like 2001, A Space Odyssey, but that's a film that has proven influential over decades and decades, and has clearly not aged much at all. It's too difficult to assess whether Arrival, or any other Denis Villeneuve sci-fi movie, can be just as timeless, but the prospects for his movies retaining their power for many years to come look good. And, given Arrival might be his most succinct, moving, intimate, and haunting work of science fiction so far, it feels somewhat safe to assume it'll be considered the greatest of his four, so far, in the decades to come. Arrival can be a very sad film at times, but it does offer some hope in imagining a future where humanity comes into contact with alien beings with this sci-fi film, which is light on action, being character-focused and more about communication than standard science fiction conflict. It's a movie that unfolds patiently and stands out in that regard, both against other sci-fi movies of the 21st century so far and against Villeneuve's other sci-fi movies, which tend to have a little more by way of action and visceral excitement. Arrival is quiet and the sort of science fiction story that's able to get under one's skin and stay there, and because of how well-made and undeniably memorable it is, it's perhaps fair to say that it's Villeneuve's best science fiction film so far.